I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Now, we hear a lot about how the policies and decisions of previous generations have put the future of the youth today in danger. And there is weight in that argument. I mean, decades of unconcern for the environment have ushered in a climate emergency. Apathetic political moves leading to conflict have left more than 35 million people under the age of 18 displaced around the world. In light of International Youth Day, on today's episode, we discuss what the future looks like for young people. One of the key aspects we will be focusing on is education. Now, the United Nations wants this year's theme to highlight efforts to make this education more inclusive and accessible for all youth. We take a closer look at what's happening. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Calvin Robinson, who's a teacher and head of research at Parliament Street, joining us from London. We're also joined by Dr. Rashawn Ray, who's an associate professor of sociology and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Sciences Research at the University of Maryland, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, Dr. Ray, let me begin with you. In light of International Youth Day, the United Nations wants to highlight the theme of more accessible and inclusive education. Now, following from that and looking at the political climate around us today, the socio-economic climate around us today, what do you think are the main hindrances preventing people from accessing education?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show. When I think about access to education, particularly inclusive and equitable education, ethnic plurality isn't necessarily the issue. So in other words, people in education have gotten comfortable with seeing diversity visually. However, people haven't necessarily gotten as comfortable with structural changes that actually lead to not only individuals being accepted into universities, which is also a barrier, but even after they get there, actually dealing with the fact that they might experience more discrimination, more unjust treatment, more marginalization in those particular spaces. And I can say that my colleague and I, Dr. Audra Buck-Coleman, we've actually done a study where we followed students from their freshman to senior year, looking at their experiences in college. And I can tell you that one of the biggest things we found is that the political climate in the United States and around the world are affecting native-born students, are affecting international students, are affecting their relationships with each other, are affecting how they think about their future job prospects, and is really shaping the ways in which they think about what society is going to mean moving forward.
Right, and you mentioned here a list of factors and how they change and they impact the students. And I want to talk about that in greater depth. But before that, I'm going to jump to Mr. Robinson and talk to him about the same point. Now, something very interesting that Dr. Ray mentioned here was access to equitable education. Now, what does equity mean in this case? Explain to our viewers.
I think that's a very interesting point because in the English education system in particular, we've been looking at this a lot lately and thinking about, okay, so this child is from this background or this child has this disadvantage in life. So what can we do differently to help them through the education system? And I think in all honesty, we've gone too far in the opposite direction in that we've got to a point where we're now making excuses and we're in result lowering standards and lowering expectations. And if we want to raise aspirations for all young people, we need to higher our standards and our aspirations and have high expectations for all children, no matter where they're from, no matter what their background or their disadvantage, and kind of pull them all up that ladder at the same time.
Right, but here when we're talking about standards, what steps are there? I mean, we talk about standardized testing, and we know that there are certain measures that are taken, and studies have come out that they disadvantage people from certain backgrounds. So what standard are we aspiring towards? One that only is befitting for a certain group, or one that is created considering all groups?
See, I don't think there's certain standards for certain groups. I think we can have high expectations for all individuals, no matter where they're from. And that conversation there is the problem, I think, in that when I talk about standards, I'm talking about a teacher in a classroom at the front passing on their knowledge and their experience to a room full of students. And that doesn't necessarily need to be in a different manner depending on your ethnic minority status or your social status or anything like that. And that's where we've gone wrong, in that we've tried to have special circumstances, and it's actually narrowing and singling people out where they don't need to be.
Right. Mr. Robinson, that's an important point you make, but I do want Dr. Ray take on it as well. Now, throughout my education, and I'm sure this is the case for all my viewers as well, you do see privilege as playing a major role. I mean, it allows you access to understand certain kind of literature, even language. It plays into the entire educational process there. Now, Dr. Ray, trying to make sense of what Mr. Robinson said, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I think about what it means to be equitable and some kind of the assumption that standards are being lowered, instead I see something different. Instead, in the United States, what we just witnessed over the past several months was a firestorm of individuals who people would consider to be extremely privileged, particularly as it relates to income and wealth, who were actually paying for their children to end up at top universities. That's not something that poor people were experiencing. That's not something primarily that racial and ethnic minorities were experiencing. That was something that was acute among people who were privileged, who are using their wealth and income to actually get something that some other people couldn't necessarily access. And they were actually cheating at it at some of the top universities, not only in the United States, but around the world. I think the other thing I know, teaching thousands of students at some of the major universities in the United States, from obviously University of Maryland, but working with students at University of California, Berkeley, University of Michigan, University of Memphis, Indiana University. One thing I know is that students come, particularly from low-income backgrounds. And one thing I can tell you at the undergrad level, as well as getting master's and graduate and PhDs, if those students are in those programs, it's typically because they definitely deserve to be there, because they typically haven't had the same resources. They typically haven't had the same access to other types of resources, such as studying for standardized tests, which we know are already culturally biased. It's not necessarily like those tests are objective. So we have to be very clear about how we frame what it means to lower standards, because it leads to this assumption, at least in the United States, that all of a sudden affirmative action, for example, means that you're giving people some kind of leg up, or you're giving them something that they didn't deserve. Right. And instead, what I've seen, on the other hand, is that students definitely deserve those. And if they had the same resources as other students, they would definitely succeed.
Right. Now, you both have given perspectives on this matter. I'd like to take the discussion forward and talk a little more about how the education system, how it's influencing the youth, and especially when we're talking about these future leaders. How are the political dynamics in the world, as Dr. Ray, you mentioned earlier as well, how are they impacting the youth?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned previously, as we think about the political climate and how it's impacting youth today, Dr. Audra Buck Coleman and I did this study, and essentially what we found is that the political climate is stymieing students' abilities to learn. And what I mean by that is they're so focused on what's happening politically, whether that be dealing with racial discrimination, hate crimes, but also dealing with other factors such as recessions and economic downturns, as they think about which majors they want to major in. I mean, you have students making different decisions, going into majors that they didn't necessarily want to because they're worried about their future job prospects. And one thing we know over the past, say, 15 years is that young adults at the beginning of the recession, say a decade ago, they were actually more independent. They were more likely to be attending higher education. They were more likely to be living alone. They were more likely to be paying their own bills. These are things that we've seen that we consider to be progress. But if you ask those students whether or not they're going to do better or worse than their parents, a lot of them are saying worse. And that has to do with politics. That has to do with the economy. And it's completely shaping this millennial generation and Generation Z.
Right. Mr. Robinson, going from the points that were made here, but also talking about the curriculum, we have heard a lot of activists around the world saying that the curriculum is not upgraded to the crises that the world faces today, whether it be in climate change or the politics that is occurring at this point in time, which is unique. What do you have to say about that? Do you think that there is enough focus on that aspect of education?
I do worry about that. There have been a lot of conversations lately about things like, should we replace Mozart with rap artists on the curriculum and make it more relevant for the youth of today? I think that's where we come again to lowering standards. We've got to teach the best there has been, and we should teach that to all. And that's raising cultural literacy. And I think that's what Dr. Ray was touching on, that these people from disadvantaged backgrounds might not know Shakespeare or Mozart. And we've got to encourage that. We've got to pass that knowledge on to them so they can survive in those more privileged arenas. And I think when we're talking about politics in school, what worries me the most in the US and in the UK in particular is this left-wing indoctrination in that most educators are of a left-wing stance. I think there was 80 to 90% of all teachers would vote for a left-wing party. And if these are the people teaching our children, there's no diversity in their opinions and in the biases, that worries me dramatically.
Right. Mr. Robinson, picking up something you mentioned here, that they should be able to survive in the privileged system that they are going to be placed in the future. Now, at the risk of sounding too idealistic, isn't that a failure in the education system in itself? If it is continuously reproducing a system which allows certain people to succeed more than others?
Right. So we have to fill that gap by giving them the knowledge they need, that cultural literacy, that cultural capital. They need to experience theatre and the arts. They need to know about the greatest music composers there have been.
So they can participate and they can be in the same rat race. I'm talking about a more radical transformation here.
Okay, in what way would that be? Would that be doing away with all of this stuff that we consider great, the classics, etc., just to make it more accessible? Because I don't think that's the right way. I think we need to make everyone aware of these, and that's how we encourage people to be inclusive, rather than taking things away.
All right. Dr. Ray, do you also agree with that, with those thoughts?
No, not exclusively. I don't agree with those, and I'll contextualize it a bit. First thing is, it doesn't have to be an or. It can be an and. So the assumption that some kind of way that Mozart, simply because it's classical, is better than other genres of music, say like rap, for example, when, just as an example, you have Kendrick Lamar, who has actually won international awards for his poetry. You have Tupac's lyrics being taught at major universities around the world. I don't necessarily think it has to be an or. It could be an and. And I think that's part of the problem on the other side, is that people like to do an or. And people like to frame things as if the history and the way things have always been has been correct, when in fact, there would be a lot more people doing classical music if people weren't necessarily excluded historically. I want to make one point about this. Toni Morrison recently passed away. Right. International poet, author. And I read a story about how a student who was a great student, African-American student, who was adopted by a white family in the United States, had went to great schools, got to college, was a great student, and was taking a literature course. And he had never read a book by an African-American scholar before. Went to college and had never read a book by an African-American scholar. He read one of Toni Morrison's books, and he started crying in class. And he said, I never knew that Black people could write like this. See, that's part of the problem when we've always used what was before instead of aiming to integrate and incorporate what's going on. There are tons of great writers, tons of great literature people around the world. And when you look at the makeup of people who are viewed as artists, people who are viewed as authors, people who are viewed as classics, you see an underrepresentation. That underrepresentation isn't because people are underperforming. That underrepresentation is because people are excluded. And being in higher education, one thing I know is the assumption is made that these are these liberal bastions of glory, and that's not simply the case. There are a lot of people across the political spectrum, conservative or otherwise. The problem is that oftentimes conservatism now has been linked to the alt-right, which is then linked to white supremacy. So you have people who are detaching from that. And if conservatives actually want to address some of these fundamental issues and deal with this, then they need to separate themselves from some of the alt-right ideology that exists in their political parties. Right.
Dr. Ray, you make points there. But moving on with this discussion, Mr. Robinson, I want to touch upon more, and you as a teacher will be able to enlighten us better regarding this, the importance of empathy. And I'm not just talking about students in higher education, but in primary schooling as well. How much of a role should that play, and how would you say that that should be inculcated in the classroom so that the problems we see today, whether it being the migration crisis, whether it being racism, the rise of the right wing, all these problems that we see today, they can perhaps be curbed in the future?
That's a good question. I think a lot of this lack of empathy is something we need to focus on, because there's an emphasis on looking after the self and this pursuit of happiness, for example, is quite a selfish pursuit. I think we need to be looking more at community service and serving others rather than serving ourselves. And that is character building. That is something that we as teachers can encourage young people to look after each other and to look after people in their wider community, whether it's the school or where they live or where they go to work. So that is something we need to be doing more of. I think touching on briefly what Dr. Ray said about the curriculum side of things. Yes, it isn't always an and/or situation. We can have multiple things, but the curriculum is finite. So whatever we add to the curriculum, we take something away. So we always have to consider that. So if we're adding a new subject or a new area, we've got to think, what are we taking away? What are the students going to lose out on if we introduce this?
Right, but how do we make these informed decisions? Like you're saying that the curriculum is finite, you need to make smart choices. Now, considering the crises we are in today, and I will continuously mention them because those are the conversations that young people are having. Climate change, migration, they're talking about socialism now, there is more interest in it. Now, how do we shift the curriculum in a way that it informs this generation that's curious about all of these things, that sees all of these as future potential dangers and is better informed about them?
Well, I think climate change is already a large part of our national curriculum in England. It's already on our geography and PSHE subjects, so it is taught. But the problem is not that it's taught, it's that how young people perceive it and how the media is perceiving it at the moment, in that these Greta Thunberg's Friday strikes, for example, encouraging young people to take a day out of school is atrocious. They're missing out on important learning, important knowledge in a whole range of subjects to make a political point. And while that point is important, and it is great that young people are becoming more politically active, we shouldn't take away from their education to do that. Talk about it on a Saturday or Sunday, write about it, do a protest, do a petition. There are other ways of communicating the need to raise the debate about climate change as a specific example. And I think we should be encouraging all our young people to be in school as much as possible.
But I think the point that they try to make here, and I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but from what I can interpret, is that take this seriously enough because we are putting our education on the sidelines to make this point. I mean, it's about a sustainable future. If there is no earth, if there is no clean air, then the education, where will you use it?
So is it about that, or is it about bunking a day off school because a load of your friends are doing it? I don't know. I can't speak for the young people that are taking time out. But what I can say is that we are teaching about climate change. Our country is doing a lot more than most countries in order to help the global situation. If these young people really care, they shouldn't be ditching their plastic bottles on the street while they're out protesting. And they should be focusing on countries like China that are actually damaging the world a lot more than we are.
Well, if we talk about the European Union, it is a fact that the subsidies on fossil fuels are still the same. I mean, while you're saying that the country is doing enough, there is still a lot of backlash that they're still not doing enough, given how much time they've had for progression. But on that point that you raise regarding political activism, that is an interesting point, and that's something that I'm going to take to Dr. Ray before we end this segment here, is political activism and children and young people becoming more into it, becoming more inclined towards it. Why do you think they are going towards it in a rapid force? What do you think is driving them towards it?
Yeah, I think what's driving young people toward political activism is the simple fact that we are in the middle of a global social movement. We're in a movement for, in the United States and around the world, a movement for Black lives. We're in a movement for climate change, and not just climate change, but people understanding and realizing that it's real and the ways that people contribute to it. We are in the middle of a global economic downturn. Youth are going to bear the brunt of some of these political trade wars that's going on between different countries around the world. And so I think part of what's happened is it's a very important fundamental point. Youth around the world have grown up today thinking that the world was going to be a better place. Their parents told them that. Their teachers told them that. That's what they thought the world was going to be. And over the past 5 to 10 years or so, that hasn't been their reality. So as they are coming up in this particular era, and part of this we have to think about, people who are even say in their late 20s, but definitely in their 30s and 40s. I'm currently teaching college students, for example, who definitely weren't alive when some of the large wars in the Middle East that involved the Americas and Europe were going on. And they definitely weren't around when 9/11 happened in the United States. So many of them weren't even born then. So all of a sudden you grow up in the United States in particular with an African-American identifying president, and then you get a new president who completely goes against some of the ideals that you thought was going on. And you feel like they have been lied to. And when people feel like they've been lied to, they tend to take things into their own hands, which typically means protesting, which is their fundamental right to do. We should never tell people they shouldn't do those type of things, but instead we should aim to understand what they want, dealing with gun violence and other sort of issues or things they're concerned about, and we should really be paying attention and listening.
Right. On that point, unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment, but thank you so much, Dr. Rashawn Ray, for joining us from Washington, D.C., and thank you so much, Mr. Calvin Robinson, for joining us from London. Both of your points were very strong and very valuable to this discussion. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss this further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, before the break, we discussed what's blocking the road to better quality education, one that is more inclusive and accessible. Now, keeping with the focus on International Youth Day, we'll talk about more broader but an equally important question. How much disengagement do the leaders of today have with the youth? And what impact does that disconnect have? Joining us to talk about this is Haley Wilson, American politics and foreign policy analyst, joining us from London, Benjamin Wolf, managing editor of the Metropole, joining us from Tel Aviv, and Zain Ashraf, founder and CEO of the pioneering social entrepreneurship platform, Seed Out, joining us from Lahore. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this show. Now, Zain, let me begin with you. What impact are the economic anxieties having on the youth today?
Right. I think with the given situation, the political situation, the social situation, even if you look at the stock market, and if you talk about the venture capitalists from the world, everybody is scared to, invest at this time in Pakistan. So I think, having said that, when you talk about 60% of the population, which is youth of Pakistan, I believe that we are already in such a vulnerable situation. When, with these kinds of environment, you have to come up with a startup or a new idea, and you have to engage venture capitalists and, angel investors around the globe. So it gets a little more difficult for them to. But at the same time, when, you have certain situations like that, it also creates lots of opportunities, because when we see that the dollar is rising and, there's so many duties on import, then there's a new market, a new vacuum in the society as well. Obviously, There's more opportunities. You have to get into localization and produce more products in Pakistan, made in Pakistan for Pakistanis as well. So I think the message for youth would be that, they can look for all the vacuum that has been created because of this inflation, because of the current situation, and then, opt for the right decision at the right time.
Right. Haley, now let me begin with you, but from a different point here. Now, going back to what I was talking about, the disconnect that the youth have with the leaders, do you think that there is a global realization of it?
Absolutely. I think that one of the main issues getting in the way of youth connecting with leaders now is simply that we don't have a lot of generational representation in our government, especially in the United States. The majority of our leaders right now are baby boomers, which is representing a completely different generation than the majority of the population at this point. So I think that a lot of youth are hesitant to get involved in politics because they don't feel that they're represented, which could also be a pretty big motivation as well. So you're seeing it work on both ends of the spectrum. But, this is a different world for the youth. I mean, compared to our parents' generation, I say our because I am a millennial. Compared to our parents' generation, it's different economically, politically, environmentally, and socially. There's a number of different issues that have made the youth sort of distrust leadership in a number of ways.
Right, and you point out some very important points there, some that I will want to touch upon. Zain, now talking about how our concerns, social concerns, are different from those of the previous generations, what is your take on that?
I think social concerns that, we have to step up. We have to see that, what we have to do right now. And be it climate change, be it litter-free, anger-free zones, be it we have to look out for different environmental changes that need to be done in Pakistan. Our elders have done what they have done. I think every revolutionary change has to undergo from series of evolutionary changes, and we have to become those evolutionary changes in the given world. And we have to stand up, and rather than relying on our elders and the decisions that the previous generation has taken,
right.
We should add more value and look for the things that can take Pakistan to a more progressive stage.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Zain Ashraf, for us. Benjamin, now jumping to you. Given our political turmoil globally, we're seeing very turbulent times. How do you think that's impacting the youth and their political consciousness? How do you think that's affecting their development?
I think we're in the interesting situation that youth globally has inherited a world that's actually very prosperous and also stable in a historical comparison. But at the same time, now it's changing a lot. And the young people themselves are not really in power or don't have a lot of political power. And while they may have gotten a stable and wealthy world, they themselves often struggle to find good, well-paying jobs or be allowed into higher positions in any way. So this is the main clash now. And I think for a long time, millennials and also the new generation Z thought, well, it's all going to sort out itself in some way, and we don't really have to be political. But in recent years, we've seen that's not the case. Like, many people were shocked about Brexit, about Trump, about a lot of other developments, about climate change. And there is, especially in recent years, I see a lot of youth mobilization and the realization, okay, if we want our ideas of the world to work out, then we also need to be politically active.
Right, and that's an important realization that we are witnessing through greater activism. Now, Hilly, going and following from this point that we're talking about, that there needs to be greater activism. Now, the main hindrance often for young people is that their voices are seen to be immature. They don't have the grasp on actual practical matters. So that's why they're often marginalized. But why is it important, and how do you think people and world leaders and communities can integrate those voices in public policies?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, because you look at some movements that have taken off in the United States in the past few years, especially, which has inspired a global conversation as well. For example, the Parkland teens, after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, we really had a huge youth movement mobilized to end the big political discussion on gun control by doing something about it. And it really started a conversation about the relevance of youth in politics. And I think that the United States is really underutilizing the tool of youth mobility, specifically the Democratic Party, and that there are ways that that youth can be used in ways that aren't just sort of political tools. They can be inspiring to a whole nother generation that's below them. You see this with climate change activists as well. And it's sort of starting a new conversation about how relevant the youth will be in politics in the future. And I think that there's nowhere to go but up.
Given the political climate, as I mentioned before, is very turbulent, the concerns seem to be towards whether the system that exists today can be sustainable for the future or not. Benjamin, what are your thoughts on that? As a young person yourself and interacting with young people, what is the consensus on that? Do you think that the world we live in today is sustainable for tomorrow?
Certainly not, and I think many young people don't think it's sustainable. But I do think that we do have a lot of good institutions, and that especially young people today, they don't want to tear them down, but they want to transform them, and they want to have a role in them and a say and be listened to, and they want to change them, often from within, sometimes from without. And it's happening in some places. It's harder in other places. We've also seen strong youth movements in the Arab world, for example, which were often then crushed, or sometimes they actually led to change. So, and it's usually not a complete revolutionary change in the sense of we want to change everything, but we want to simply our values and the ideas of how we can live and how we see that our peers in other countries may live already. We want to get there.
Right, and you mentioned here how we want our values to be noticed, to be taken care of. What are the distinct values of this coming generation? Do you see any difference between those from the elder generations, from the previous generations? What's distinct and unique about the values here?
Yeah, I think of course it's always hard because it's still a lot of people, but I see a strong trend towards more inclusivity, more environmental awareness, and maybe more also fairness in a way that everybody wants to get their chance, of course, to make a difference, but also others should get their chance. But without this tinge of ideology that maybe was in the past often a part of it, which really veered then into the communist direction. It's more like it's possible to combine these both things without being an ideologue about it. So that I would say is for many people the kind of, or for many young people,
right,
the guiding values.
Right. Now, Haley, talking a little more about the American society and also the global stage at large, there is this trend that's being observed regarding young people having this fascination with socialism. What are your thoughts on that?
That there's this new sort of focus on creating a world. Not necessarily, this isn't a new focus. A lot of generations have gone about the notion that they want to leave the world better than they came into it. And I think that youth have an obsession with socialism because right now in American politics, there's just extreme political polarization where we have a very, very angry right wing and a very, very angry left wing. Very hard to find political consensus. And I think that a lot of young people who are coming in to the political world at this point see two main options. I can either be angry on one side or angry on the other side. And it's very rare to meet in the middle. So I think that a lot of people, a lot of young people especially, have this interest in socialism because it's a program that says it's going to take care of you. That where maybe these institutions will fail you, or maybe the economy isn't working out for you, or you're unable to get a job, there are some sort of programs that will be in place in case that happens, rather than this sort of winner-takes-all capitalist mentality. I think that it's starting to shift the conversation because of extreme political polarization.
Right. Haley, as you mentioned here, and I want Benjamin's take on as well, but I'll put this question to you first, that there is this great, deep political polarization, and the young lot do seem to realize it. But the question is, do you think that this polarization will get deeper? I mean, we talk about social media being the main form of communication, and we have seen how the algorithms at play have just caused for this polarization to go one step further. In the future, do you think that there will be some way to reckon with this polarization?
Social media has definitely been a pretty divisive form of communication. And because of the algorithms, like you said, a lot of people are kind of voicing their concerns or reading news into an echo chamber. So many people are looking at things that they agree with or things that they are particularly passionate about, and then only receiving news or intel about those particular issues. So you take an issue like climate change, for example, which in the United States is extremely polarizing. You have people on one side who staunchly believe that it's real because the evidence in the science points that it is, but then you have a very religious element that says, no, we don't believe that this is true because all of this evidence goes against what we believe.
Or you have Donald Trump.
I think that a lot. Yeah, exactly. And you have politicians who represent this belief that maybe this isn't real, so that if you're then questioning it and you go onto the internet to find answers, and you're looking into very polarizing social media accounts or very polarizing news sources, you become an uneducated consumer of the news media. And I think that news literacy and media literacy is a big issue for youth today more than really any other generation because of the exposure and the constant release of information into the news media.
Right. Benjamin, he said it best that polarization is an issue because of the mediums that exist right now. So can we expect, or should we expect, the future generations to be even more polarized than the generations that came before them?
Honestly, it's hard to say. absolutely think that polarization or social media is changing the game, but I've read a couple of interesting studies that say that most of these fake news on the internet, for example, are shared by baby boomers or older, so by people who did not grow up with the internet and that just have struggled adapting to this new environment. And that actually millennials, and especially Generation Z, are much more skeptical and much more selective in sharing things, both sharing things but also reading things on the internet. So we might see a shift. It will still take a while. I also think that we need institutions and journalists and everyone else to adapt of how you should deal with this new world of media. But I don't see a trend that it necessarily has to get more polarized. I see younger people be much more skilled in dealing with these new technologies.
Right. And when we're talking about in the future moving forward, what do you think are some of the things that the younger generation should keep in mind, learning from the elder generation? I mean, we've been criticizing them, but what is some of the things that they should retain?
Well, there are probably a lot. I think, personally, I believe the need for compromise is really one of the things that got lost a lot in these last years, and that in the high times of development in different eras of different countries, was always if different groups could really come together and see their common goals and reach across the divide. So I think we can learn that from them, and we shouldn't go down the road of exactly becoming too entrenched in one thing we believe, and simply sometimes you have this with these extreme online campaigns against someone who's inherently bad or good, or at least depicted as that. And I think that's a little bit of a dangerous tendency also among the youth. Sometimes you always need to keep the humanity of the other person in mind and then reach hopefully a compromise.
Right. Haley, from what Benjamin said, another thing that popped into my head is the rise in individualism. We are seeing that more and more in the political culture and the social spheres. Now, are there any dangers to that? Do you see any dangers to that?
I definitely see some dangers to individualism. I think that many politicians speak about the collective we, where there are a lot of young people who really are focused on themselves, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But millennials have been called, the most self-absorbed, self-involved generation because of, a focus on mental health and self-care and other things like that. But I think that it's definitely dangerous to decide to stay on the side of idealism on issues like climate change, when that isn't an individualistic issue, that's a world issue. That's an issue that affects everyone. And when you think about when you're considering your actions and not considering the impact that those have on others or on the environment or the greater population in general, that's when it starts to become an issue. I'm a firm believer that just as the other guest said, that nothing can be reached without compromise. And individualism, I think, can be just as polarizing. It can be very difficult to come to a consensus when you're not focusing on the collective population or the collective good.
Right. And Haley, talking about the collective good, this is a question I put to our guest earlier as well. One of the main concerns of the millennials is the fact that there are so many hindrances to equal access to opportunity. What structural changes do you think need to be made on an urgent basis to make sure that the community flourishes in a manner that it takes everyone forward with them?
Right. I feel like one of the biggest ways to make that more equitable is through education. Right now in the United States, going to university or to college, especially a four-year college, is a luxury that many can't afford. And predatory lenders take advantage of that and put youth into student debt for years. Right now, the average student in the U.S. has $38,000 worth of student debt that accrues interest while they are in school. So if you think about the opportunity that you're hindered from having when you have a $500 a month payment every month on top of your rent, on top of your other expenses, it's very hard to see millennials retiring or millennials able to afford homes. Mm-hmm. So I think that whole issue, a lot of people are seeing as a millennial individualistic issue, but it's really not. there's, the generation before us, baby boomers, are really not seeing it incumbent upon themselves to care for the generation after them. And right now, millennials are mostly concerned with paying for the war that happened during our younger years that is still going on. Most American youth don't know a world without the U.S. being at war, and all of these other issues that are really becoming more central for younger people.
Right. Benjamin, just before we begin to wrap up the show, I want to talk about displacement, and I want to talk about all those people that have been displaced. Now, this is a youth that is forgotten, essentially. The United Nations estimates that there are almost 35 million people under the age of 18 who are displaced around the world with either refugee statuses or not even those. Now, taking this discussion forward, what do you think needs to be kept in mind when we're talking about that youth?
I think, as my co-guest said, opportunity for young people is maybe the most important thing, and that goes also, especially for these displaced young people. So it is not only an imperative to provide them these opportunities, it's also good strategy, good long-term strategy. People who don't see any opportunities, especially if they're maybe refugees or displaced people, they will be attracted by radical ideologies, by all sorts of things, or they will just be miserable, and that's in nobody's interest. So the earlier you start to give them opportunity, education is one thing, but it's also at least some sort of adequate healthcare environment where they can work in some way or be an apprentice and so on. You create a much better world down the road, and you prevent a lot of problems that will surely occur otherwise. And big powers of corporations or whoever should realize that.
Right, and those are very strong points you make, Dhirbin. And on that note, we have run out of time. But thank you so much, Benjamin Wolf, for joining us from Tel Aviv. And thank you, Haley Wilson, for joining us from Dublin. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.